Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. I first got to know Daniel Padilla Peralta when we were both on the editorial board of Eidolon, the online classics magazine that ran from 2015 to 2020 under Donna Zuckerberg's leadership. Since then, I have learned an immense amount from Daniel, and not just about Roman history, which is his specialty, but about how to think critically about what classics is, what it has been, and what it might become. Daniel's new book, which we'll be discussing, is called Classicism and Other Phobias, and it came out earlier this year with Princeton University Press. In the book, Daniel makes a crucial distinction between classicism, which we can think of as a system of aesthetic determination, and classics as a discipline. His aim is not to abandon Homer or the ancient texts, or even the early modern texts that engage with the ancient texts, but rather to scrutinize the historical material processes by which some domains of human experience have come to be identified and valued and valorized as classical. Drawing on the work of Sylvia Wynter and many others, Daniel traces how classicism has operated as what he calls an instance of overrepresentation, a construct that systematically displaces other ways of being human and other aesthetic traditions. In our conversation, we talk about these kinds of things and more, about what it means to read ancient texts in transformative rather than clinical ways, about oppositional communities of inquiry, that's a really important rubric for Daniel, about Blackness and indigeneity, about Gaza and decolonization, and about grief and hope for the future of ancient studies. This is another long episode of Lesche. I think it might be the longest one I've ever done, but the urgency and depth of Daniel's thought demand the time, and I promise you'll want to hear all of it. Daniel is one of the most incisive and generous thinkers in the field today, and the conversation we had was wide-ranging and thought-provoking in ways that I hope will resonate with anyone who cares about the study of the ancient world. But I especially hope that you'll listen all the way through if you already think, A, that you understand Daniel's take on classics, and B, that you disagree with it. You might just find some surprises here. Daniel Padilla Peralta is professor of classics and associated faculty in African American studies and affiliated faculty in the programs of Latino studies and Latin American studies and the university's Center for Human Values at Princeton University. He's the author of Undocumented, a Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, which came out with Penguin in 2015, of Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, which came out with Princeton in 2020, and Classicism and Other Phobias, which came out with Princeton just this past summer. A quick note that, as ever, I have put a few references in the show notes. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Daniel Padilla Peralta, author of Classicism and Other Phobias. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
Classicism and Other Phobias began with an invitation to give the W.B. Du Bois lectures at Harvard in the late winter, early spring of 2022. It grew out of a series of interdependent projects that had been occupying my attention in the early stages of the pandemic and in the years prior to the pandemic. I had been pursuing some work in the realm of what this podcast host has termed critical classical reception. And I had also been trying to ground some of the research I was doing on Black classicism within a much more robust interpretive framework. So the lectures afforded me an opportunity to do that. And in the course of drafting material for 3 lectures, I realized that there was something akin to a book. And so after delivering the lectures, I set about the task of trying to bring the various parts of the project together under one roof. That's where Classicism and Other Phobias took shape.
How was writing this book, even if it originated in the lectures, how was it different than writing in the other genres that you have written in? So you've written in memoir and you've written in kind of traditional academic books, but I'm curious about whether how the process and approach and methodologies in writing this book differed from those.
It differed in several respects. I mean, one noticeable difference, at least to me as a writer, was that because I had tried my hand in these very different formats, I felt more at ease in experimenting with my own prose than I had previously. I was committed for this project in foregrounding the lived experience of being a practitioner in the field. And so whereas the memoir had focused on my life as an undocumented immigrant, and the first monograph had donned the objectivizing discourse of the Roman historian, in this book I thought, okay, I want to wed the two in a way. I mean, I certainly want to ditch the pretense of sort of high objectivity, but I also wanted to fold in some lessons learned in the context of writing for classicist-facing publications, most notably Eidolon. And as a result, one, I think, beneficial aspect of the craft of this book was that it could more confidently step into directions of prose and of argument than any previous book-length publication that I had even sort of thought of in my head, let alone actually worked on. And that, I think, made for a much more satisfying experience working on the book than the preceding two. The memoir had me throwing up my hands in frustration as I tried to sort of unlearn habits of writing that I had accumulated in the course of my professionalization. And the traditional monograph was one whose constraints I chafed against and found myself often disavowing, even as I sort of doubled down on the commitment to see it through to its completion. This was better, I think.
Well, I have to say, I mean, your writing always reads beautifully, but I think the prose stylistics here are just really it's like out of this world. It's beautifully written. And I was hoping that we could start with some terms, since you foreground this concept of classicisms in the title. It's in the title. But for you, it's very important to make a distinction between the concept of classicism and classics, kind of whatever that is. And I was hoping you could say a little bit about what those terms are for you and what the distinction is. I mean, you write about it right up front, and maybe you could also share a passage on the definitional directions.
Yes, it was very important that the book opened with a definition of classicism and how I understood it, partly because I sensed, even in the framing of this project in its earliest stages, that there would be folks who would find my critical stance to the field of classics and disciplinarity as amounting to little more than an exhortation to ditch Homer or something like that. And I was like, I'm not interested in ditching Homer, but I am interested in trying to differentiate more cleanly classicism from classics. And so what I say in the opening pages of the book is this: I understand classicism as a system of aesthetic determination and calibration that binds, 1, a tradition received and contested within communities across space and time, to 2, assertions of chronological precedence and priority, and 3, normative presumptions of value. So for me, all 3 of these have to work together. And it's important to think of classicism, at least for the purposes of this book, as separable from classics, which I define on the next page in talking about how I am looking to classicism and not classics for scrutiny, because my interest is less with the substantive contents of the field of classics and its past and current versions, and more with the historical material processes whereby some domains of human experience come to be identified and valued as classical. So throughout the book, I'm interested in a process that I designate as classicism in conversation with other scholars. And that process does not necessarily have to have the contents of the field of classics at its center. The contents of the field of classics, as they assume disciplinary structure, are one iteration of the process of classicism. And I argue already in the introduction that one of the distinctive features of the field of classics is that it comes to monopolize classicism, or rather that classics is understood as a kind of like first-rate or elevated and overrepresented form of classicism. But classicism could proceed via other objects. It can contain other contents. And so I want readers to sort of think with that in the pages that follow.
Could you say a little bit about this term overrepresentation, which is an important term of art for you throughout the book?
So the term overrepresentation is one that I draw along with several other related concepts from the writings of the pioneering figure in Black studies, Sylvia Wynter. And in her work, Wynter used overrepresentation to mark the emergence of a construct of the human that comes online in the early modern period, really begins to take shape in the first few decades after the first contact of 1492, and then is the focus of a sustained multi-century project of global dispersion. This construct of the European man that is generalized into the human and that undergoes a kind of global scaling up is what lies at the heart of Wynter's account of overrepresentation. So she's interested in exploring that insofar as it relates to a series of interdependent processes. She wants us to think about the emergence of the academic humanities and is concerned with documenting how, in the context of the humanities and also in the context of other knowledge production enterprises, a particular ideal of the European man comes to take over and systematically displace other versions of constructing the human. But she's also interested in how this has very material implications for the valuation and extraction of labor from dispossessed and exploited Native Indigenous communities and also from enslaved Africans. As over the course of the 1500s, the Western Hemisphere is transformed into a economic structure for the exploitation and immiseration of both groups by European colonizers. And what is a key move for her that also becomes, in the introduction opening chapters, a key move for me, is to relate the process of labor extraction and exploitation to aesthetic undervaluation and underappreciation. So what she does very cleverly in Black Metamorphosis is show that insofar as this dynamic of exploitation relies on the extraction of labor, it is very important for the logic of this system that whatever aesthetic potential, whatever aesthetic capability Native Indigenous communities or enslaved Africans have, be systematically muted and displaced from view, right? We want them, the we here is the European settler colonial we want them for the purposes of their labor. And whatever aesthetic cultural productions characterize these communities are to be shunted entirely from view insofar as they are deemed irrelevant to, in fact, actively undermining of the process of extracting more labor from them. So these two operations locked into and feeding off of each other are important to me in thinking about the overrepresentation that I see as occurring with a specific way of thinking about the past, a form of thinking about the past that displaces other paths.
Within the framework where the classicism and classics is differentiated, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the way that, or say more actually about the way that one is nevertheless entrenched in the other. So in your first chapter, Epic Maroons, one of the things that jumped out to me is that you write, on an honest and searching examination of the research protocols and disciplinary genealogies of Greco-Roman classics, it emerges that the field is suspended in space-times either adjacent to or ensconced firmly within plantocracy and its direct beneficiaries. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about the ways that you see the discipline of classics as it's currently structured institutionally, practiced, taught, et cetera, as entwined in these tentacles of classicism.
Mm-hmm. So I think one way of approaching this is to put on my classical reception cap for a moment and think about two figures in the Anglophone who become really important for the development of a rights discourse, for theories about politics, and who are not classicists, although they have plenty of classical training. The two figures are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And the reason I want to bring them up is because I want first to show how, in talking about the genealogies of Greco-Roman classics, we should reflect on how the discipline, as it begins to be structured in the 16 and 1700s, enters into conversation with a host of projects that are very much intimately bound up with the exploitation of those communities that I mentioned a moment ago. So to take Hobbes first, one of the instructive lessons of thinking with and teaching Leviathan over the past 10 plus years that I've taught it semi-regularly is how richly and abundantly it draws from ancient Greek and Roman texts, even though some of Hobbes' disavowals of figures within the Greco-Roman tradition or traditions are quite apparent. I mean, he has no love for Aristotle, for instance. But in the work to seize on the potentials of these texts, Hobbes is doing several things at once. One of the things he's doing is seeking to legitimate his construction of the state of nature and the state of war. But another thing he's trying to do, and that comes to the fore in his language for describing native communities in the Americas, is show that the architecture of property that emerges in conjunction with civil society and that characterizes European societies with which he's intimately familiar is alien to, completely absent from, the Americas that is the sort of zero site for what he sees as the manifestation of the state of nature qua state of war. So for him, using Greco-Roman classics or using texts from the ancient Greek and Roman literary tradition that come eventually to be integrated under the auspices of classics is key to developing a conceptual vocabulary and indeed a universe for describing and also in plotting the domination of Europe over the Americas. In Leviathan, which at first blush is ostensibly not concerned with giving a systematic treatment of this exploitation at all. There's a similar version of this underway in John Locke too, who also attempts to clear out from the American scene any idea that native communities have something akin to a form of governance. And there again, there's an insistent and unvarying recourse to Greek and Roman texts, and also occasionally the Hebrew Bible in an effort to really ground that project. So in the passage that you read, I argue that the field is suspended in space-times either adjacent to or ensconced firmly within plantocracy and its direct beneficiaries. In the case of Locke, but also in the case of Hobbes, it's very difficult to understand the full force of their intellectual production without understanding the extent of their own direct involvement in forms of the forms of exploitation that I mentioned a moment ago. Locke is rather unambiguous in this regard, given his own commitment to the entrenchment of slaving and plantocracy in the so-called New World, but we can chart a similar story for Hobbes as well. I lay that groundwork out in conversation just now in order to put on the table a few things that are of substantive interest to me in this Epic Maroons chapter. One of them is that if we want to think about the full arc of classical reception, i.e. how thinkers in the early modern and contemporary moment make use of or return to ancient Greek and Roman texts and paradigms, it's important to start that conversation by thinking a little bit more carefully about how these thinkers that we identify as central to this reception in the early modern period are working with these texts in order to legitimate forms of structural exploitation that have very long afterlives. And with Locke and others, we can start to tell a story that extends down into the 1800s and the early 1900s, where the interface of racial slavery, which is one of my major concerns in this book, with the insistent turning back to Greek and Roman texts becomes rather conspicuous, so conspicuous that if you have eyes to see it, after a while, you can't help but see it everywhere. So that's the move that this chapter is trying to set up. It's trying to tease out of the evidence a sense of how we might begin the work of deconstructing these thinkers' relatedness and relation to the circuits of economic and racial exploitation that come to take over in the 17 and 1800s.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think it's important, in a class that I'm teaching right now, we are talking about how thinkers like these were so critical for not only for political philosophy, but also for educational philosophy in Britain, in the United States. And so I think, that's an important part of the story. I'm wondering if you could say a bit then about how you read these sorts of texts with students, like these texts that are fundamentally, foundationally classicizing in these ways. I mean, what kind of techniques or toolbox do you try to equip students with in approaching these? Because I think that, one of the kind of criticisms out there is that, and even from within classicists, is that people who are articulating a critique of the field from within the field are harmfully suggesting that the phrase has been that the baby be thrown out with the bathwater. You're teaching these texts at Princeton. I mean, both the modern and the ancient ones. What does it look like to be in the professor's classroom dealing with these kinds of texts?
Yeah, it goes to the very heart of an animating conviction of classicism and other phobias, which is about the importance of effective and transformative pedagogy to doing right by these texts in all their complicated lives and afterlives. Perhaps it might be useful for this, since we've already sort of put Hobbes and Locke on the table, to visit with one specific and short passage in John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, a passage that I do teach when I was teaching for the Freedom and Citizenship high school program at Columbia. This was a text that we would teach every summer, and it was a text that became incredibly stimulating and generative for high schoolers for reasons that I hope to make clear after I read a few sentences. So in the Second Treatise of Government, in one of the chapters, Locke fields the question, "It is often asked as a mighty objection, where are or ever were there any men in such a state of nature?" The first answer he gives in response to that anticipated objection is that all princes and rulers of independent governments are in the state of nature, because there's no supragovernmental authority that can impose its will on them. But then, more interestingly, for my purposes and for the purposes of the students I've taught, he begins giving examples that serve to give a little more point to the bigger enterprise of the second treatise. The promises and bargains for truck and the like between the two men on the desert island, mentioned by Garcilaso de la Vega in his History of Peru, or between a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America, are binding to them, though they are perfectly in a state of nature in reference to one another. For truth and keeping of faith belongs to men and not as members of society. So one of the moves he makes there is to begin the work of showing that it is possible for people in the state of nature to enter into agreements with each other. And he begins to cite these examples of people on desert islands or between a Swiss person and an Indian in the woods of America. But they're not bound by any other authority. They're bound simply by trust and the keeping of faith. But then when you start looking deeper into the Second Treatise of Government, you come up against this issue that my students found very interesting, which is that even though Locke acknowledges that it's perfectly feasible, in fact to be expected, that people who come from different communities can enter into contracts and agreements with each other, when you begin to look at the particulars of political communities spread out across space and time, some of these communities, it turns out, have, in Locke's view, a full-fledged apparatus of law, and other communities consist primarily of savages who do not have a full complex or even a partial complex of laws for instructing members of those communities to relate effectively to each other and to relate to people beyond those communities. And this introduces a problem for Locke that he tries to resolve, particularly by talking about property. In the summers that we've discussed the Second Treatise of Government, one of the things that has most elicited comment and attention from the high schoolers in the classes that I've taught the text for is Locke's account of Native and Indian communities. And the reasons for this, I think, are several-fold. So first of all, several of them claiming, as they did and do in indigenous background and indigenous families, instinctively recoil against Locke's disparagement of the communities of the Americas. And they also recoil against Hobbes's treatment of this, which is posed in much the same language. But there's another reason for their reaction, another dimension to their reaction that I found very helpful to think with, and that brings me now to how these thinkers work with ancient texts in ways that might be sort of instructive or generative for us. They approach these ancient texts and the kinds of authority or leverage that they might derive from them as living, animate projections into their present. These texts are very alive for people like Hobbes and Locke. In the case of Hobbes, one of the things that's most revealing is his own exhortations against the young of his time who have read too much Republican history, and by that he really means Livy, and who are coming up with all of these fantastical projects to overthrow the crown and stuff like that, which Hobbes got to see play out in his own life. And what really has struck some of my students over the years, as it has struck me, is that these thinkers accord a space and a place to these texts because they recognize that the texts have real revolutionary potential. They can be very explosive. They can be explosive in ways that cannot be fully anticipated by their interpreters, by their teachers, by the most sedentary readers. They can turn out to have all kinds of ripple effects. I am moved by that because something that is not infrequently lost in some of the academic settings that characterize my day-to-day existence is the idea that these texts can incubate within themselves forms of insurgence, forms of revolution that have real-time material effects on local communities and on global orders. And so to hear or to read Locke thinking about the extent to which individuals across political communities can make promises with each other because trust and keeping of faith belongs to men is, at one level, simply a very sort of devious way of giving voice to a point that Sylvia Wynter systematically deconstructs in her own writing. Namely, this idea that what we see in Europe as characteristic of how people might enter into community with each other can be generalized to the world over, irrespective of the political communities and the political compacts that might exist elsewhere. But for me, there's another far more consequential lesson than like the fine-grained reading of this particular passage of Locke in a classroom with students. I am thinking more about how Locke, how Hobbes, and how any of the thinkers we engage can seed for them the possibility of thinking in a metacritical way about their relation to text as a potentially revolutionary relationship, no matter how unrevolutionary, seemingly a-revolutionary, the arguments of these texts may be. And I think that this is a lesson that can be brought to the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts, and that benefits being brought into conversation with ancient Greek and Roman texts by virtue of the fact that more often than not, when these texts are taught, it is sometimes without any clear or abiding sense of how these texts have historically served to catalyze revolutionary movements, still less how these texts have served in the present moment to give substance and expression to people thinking about transforming their world. So this is why I think the kinds of criticisms that are sometimes brought to bear against these kinds of moves in reading and these kinds of critiques of reading seem to be misplaced. I think if anything, and here I will now make a slightly grandstanding proclamation, those of us who are interested in this kind of critical classical reception work are taking these texts far more seriously than those who might say that they should be studied in what seems to me a rather deadening and ossifying way, the way of keeping them in the classroom without doing much else beyond.
Well, one of the things that we're talking about, and sorry, I just want to, since I have you on the line, open this browser tab briefly. In the class that I'm teaching right now, which happens to be called Revolutionary Classics, is how in earlier periods of reading, of engagement with these texts, there was a utilitarian aspect of reading these texts that was always at the forefront. It was that these texts are kind of contemporaries in conversation with us. They contain wisdom, they contain paradigms of virtue and vice, they contain negative and positive exempla, historical, political, moral, etc. The ancient texts for a long time were treated as repositories really that were, as you said, having this contemporary power to instruct, to hold up a mirror, to, again, provide negative examples of things. But over time, there was this shift to this kind of clinical reading of them as, sort of artifacts suspended back in time that need to be approached, I guess, with this concept of Wissenschaft, that this is a science, right? That this is a kind of empiricism where we're objective and standing back, and there's a kind of scientific method that's being applied to these texts. But that strikes me as out of alignment. I mean, no matter with the approaches to the texts that Locke, Hume, whoever, that they're kind of taking just to put them in a real kind of contemporary dialogue. Maybe we see this more in contemporary political theory than amongst classicists. What I'm in a really roundabout way circling back to this form of criticism that has suggested that Americans have started taking these texts too seriously as texts to actually really be in political dialogue with, as opposed to things that you can put under the microscope or under the lab light and study objectively. And I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit to a measure of impatience with that kind of criticism sometimes. I guess to me, there would be a few questions that would need to be posed to those who voice their own desire to keep the texts firmly in the lab. One question is, well, why does it matter that these texts be subjected to this kind of clinical dissection without any sort of vivifying revolutionary or transformative commitment or aim? Why does it matter to you, the person posing that, right? But I would submit on the basis of whatever provisional response they give to that, which may not be an entirely sincere one, although not because the person in conversation is being insincere, but rather because the prospect that I'm about to enunciate for them may not be fully on their horizon. I would submit to them that for their own professed desire to actually materialize, for this clinical reading to actually unfold according to how they might wish it to unfold, there have to be revolutionary readings. Like the two coexist, and I'm not simply sort of voicing that in this like intellectually facile way of saying, well, you need some kind of like dialectic maneuver here. I think if we look at the longer historical arc within which the various humanistic disciplines have formed, the political and economic crucibles within which they've been forged and renegotiated, the move to a kind of deadening institutionalizing process that would result in the facilitation of these clinical readings is actually bound up with other more revolutionary urgences that coalesce around these texts at particularly charged political moments. Like I don't think, in other words, that you can separate the two cleanly, and I think that people who would want to have one without the other are at a minimum guilty of a kind of willful distancing from the historical record, if not a kind of like sort of fantasy world cathexis that, again, sort of elicits from me like a form of impatience. But that may be all actually secondary to what I'm about to say, which is that as I see it, the reason for being invested in the kinds of work on Showcase and Classicism and Other Phobias is that at its core, I'm just animated by the desire to be a better reader. I'm just trying to be in conversation with people who I think have alighted on some pretty excellent resources for reading. And so for folks who would want to say, well, like I'm just much more comfortable with these kinds of clinical readings that seek systematically to disconnect from the destabilizing and eruptive forces of the world around me and the sort of revolutionary potentials that are seated in those. I would say, you know what, like, do you, boo? But also, these are just some incredible resources for reading. Like how is it that in the search for this kind of clinical mode, you have separated yourself from the many varied, frictive, energizing modes of reading that could transform how you take any of the objects within this tradition, within what you have constituted as a unified tradition, within which possibilities that are foreclosed to you simply by virtue of your commitment to clinical reading may yet be opened up if only you wanted to be in solidarity with other forms of reading that exist in the interdisciplines. That's what I would say is the the sort of appropriately calibrated response. Even though I recognize that in making this kind of response, I am already showing that I might not be in a position to fully grasp why someone would want to remain wedded to clinical readings that are detached from the world, such as I understand it in the end.
Well, I think that within this framework of the clinical readings, it sort of axiomatically precludes this important rubric that you refer to as oppositional communities of inquiry. That, from that approach, then there is ultimately, if it is like this scientific thing, it's not something that allows for a plurality of accounts of anything. And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about that rubric, about oppositional communities of inquiry, which you define in the book. So perhaps you could even read us a little bit of the passage on that term from the introduction.
Yeah, so this is in the context of a brief treatment of why I am at once drawn to conversations of canons and canonicity, but also trying to sort of maintain a degree of argumentative separation from those debates. But for the interested reader, you can go straight to pages 17 and 18 of the book. I'll be reading from this section. So first, I start by describing how a seminar that had been organized at the January 2021 meeting of the Society for Classical Studies by the Eos African Receptions of Ancient Greece and Rome Collective had left a mark on me. The text chosen for that seminar was Toni Morrison's 1988 Tanner lecture, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, the Afro-American Presence in American Literature. Another text I should note that makes for excellent teaching to high schoolers and discussion with high schoolers. So in that lecture, which is later published, Morrison makes the claim that, quote, there must be some way to enhance canon readings without enshrining them, end quote. And so as I was beginning to lay the foundations for what became Classicism and Other Phobias, I kept coming back to Morrison's words, and I also kept coming back to an essay by Jacoby Adeshei Carter on racing the canon that appeared in the Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Race. Carter has a position on what the essay calls the American racial canon that proved generative for me in conceiving of how best to describe the intended effects of my and colleagues' work within the field of critical classical reception, critical ancient world studies, and so on. So here's the passage from Carter's essay. The American racial canon is missing what every good canon needs, a lively, active, oppositional set of communities of inquiry. The American race canon historically excluded the very oppositional authorities that would have had the most theoretically corrective effect on its production, end quote. And so I continue in the introduction, either as complement to or in place of the scheme of the open field that Brooke Holmes and Konstanz Gutenka have proposed in response to the polar tendencies of hypercanonicity and hyperinclusivity, one could opt instead to search for and elevate an oppositional set of communities of inquiry for exposition of a counter-narrative that proceeds from the understanding that Greco-Roman classics in its Euro-American iteration is bedeviled by the same absences and silences that mark other white-centering projects, epistemic projects. Finally, as I go on also to say on that page, there are going to be objections raised by some humanists that any effort to boost this oppositional set is vulnerable to the objection or actually sort of reifies the prospect of confusing or conflating the politics of representation and the politics of canon reformation. But I'm committed to the idea that actually we have some places to look to for inspiration about what these oppositional communities can look like that are rather close to the discipline of classics in its current institutional formation. I name on page 19 biblical New Testament and early Christian studies as one area where colleagues have begun and given real heft to the kinds of oppositional communities that are of interest to me. So if we want to think about oppositional communities in classics, we could turn and make common cause with those colleagues who have done things like model what an Asian American biblical hermeneutics would look like, what a Latine hermeneutics would look like. In short, what a form of coming together and practicing discipline looks like, that instead of eliding or seeking to efface from view the necessarily unavoidable aspects of scholarly identity as they impinge on the capacities and affordances of reading, actually says, you know what, we're going to take these seriously and we're going to organize around them. That's what an oppositional community looks like. That's the kind of community that can generate the kinds of critique of interest in.
To move on a little bit through another theme of the book that's obviously deeply intertwined with this, I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about the relationship between classicism and Blackness and Black life as you understand it. And if you could offer a summary or some working definition of the way that you're deploying the term Blackness within this book, I think that would be really helpful for listeners.
Yes, this was a concern that came up in refereeing the book. As Classicism and Other Phobias was making its way through the peer review process, one of the invitations I've received from the readers for the manuscript was to be more precise about how I understood Blackness and how I understood Black and Afro-diasporic cultural production, since the book is very committed to the idea that by centering myself within the context of Black and Afro-diasporic literary and artistic practice, I can generate this critique of classicism in the first place. So for this, I had to give a definition of Blackness. And this is the multi-part definition that I give. I start by talking about Blackness as existing in a kind of counterpoint to the whiteness that W.B. Du Bois defines famously in Darkwater and revisits in a number of other places. Whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen. So this claim to ownership, as Du Bois and readers of Du Bois have long emphasized, is predicated on false belief, but it's a fantastically potent false belief. So if we proceed from a definition of whiteness as the condition of total ownership, then Blackness is a condition of non-ownership. And this has some connection to Afro-pessimist stances that look to Blackness as being a site for the instantiation and reproduction of total objection. And while I don't fully take on board Afro-pessimist claims along these lines, I do center them as important for thinking about what Blackness can do in a project of this kind. So that's the first take on Blackness. Then there is a second claim that grows out of the first and that looks at a particular form of ownership. That is the ownership over pedigreed or valued forms of cultural reproduction. For that, I turn briefly on page 7 to this famous moment in one of James Baldwin's essays. This is the essay Stranger in the Village, which came out in 1953, and where Baldwin gives expression to his alienation from the West in describing the emotions that he feels surge in him when thinking about the inhabitants of the Swiss town where he was living. He writes, "These people," with reference to the Swiss, "cannot be, from the point of view of power, strangers anywhere in the world. They have made the modern world, in effect, even if they do not know it. The most illiterate among them is related, in a way that I am not, to Dante, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Aeschylus, Da Vinci, Rembrandt, and Racine. Go back a few centuries and they are in their full glory, but I am in Africa watching the conquerors arrive," end quote. So Teju Cole in 2016 gave a response to this, a rather earnest response, a response that is true to the sort of literal import of Baldwin's words, but misses, I think, something of their more visceral charge. Cole says, "I'm happy to own it all. I am not an interloper when I look at a Rembrandt portrait." And in support of that position, Cole also makes reference to the stack of corroborating scholarship that has served to place African artistic achievements on a level with those of the sort of semi-mythical West that Baldwin recreates in that 1953 essay. For me, the problem here and the issue that prevents me from identifying with Cole is that it doesn't take fully into account the forms of power as cultivated within racial colonial matrices that dictate who can access and who can lay claim to forms of art, and how that art comes to be valued differentially within global imperial orders.
So can I just clarify real quickly, Danielle? So is this what you're embarking upon here, kind of a critique of the citizen of the world argument?
Straight up. Like, I mean, there's no way of settling on, like, the ideal type of the citizen of the world that, in my view, can sort of overlook the extent to which that ideal type, down to that citizen of the world's very own abilities to hold on to and lay claim to things like art, is mediated and routed through these circuits of the transatlantic slave trade and its afterlives, indigenous dispossession at massive scales, and so on, right? So that's I think a very important element of the critique there. The third and final point, bearing on the definition of blackness that I'll raise now. I mean, there's a fourth point, but I mean, this third point sort of bridges to the fourth point, is that while there is a pretty vast spectrum of racialization into blackness, and while for the purposes of the book I have to perceive via a kind of metonym in taking a particular contingent form of blackness that is well known to me, blackness in the Americas, and specifically in a North American and specifically in a Northeastern American context that also links to Caribbean blackness in a Hispanophone Caribbean context. While these kinds of blackness are the kinds to which I feel answerable, I am nonetheless also gesturing in the direction of a longer running discussion in Black studies about the exhaustibility or inexhaustibility of blackness as a theoretical construct, blackness being understood not as reducible to any one episodic or historical epidermal or pseudo-biological description, as I say on page 9. Rather, and to go back to the first point, I see blackness as an ontology, one that arises from and is affirmed through relations of property, discourses of ownership, and protocols of objection. So in doing all of that, what the introduction is trying to accomplish is show that there is no sort of one-dimensional account of blackness that suffices for the purposes of classicism and other phobias, even though I have to recognize that I occupy a particular corner of blackness in its historical and contemporary formation. I'm hoping to develop out of that very contingent situatedness a set of claims about blackness in their relation to classicism that might pass the test of being evaluated alongside other historically contingent formations of blackness.
Well, and I realize our time is growing short here, but I do want to come to, and I may think there's maybe a useful route here where there's a real capitalist critique at the heart of a lot of this work, and what you're saying about blackness and whiteness and the oppositionality in its relationship to constructions of property ownership in a way brings us back to the Hobbes, brings us back to, and so I'm curious about if you could say a little bit for the listeners about how you bring indigeneity into this argument. I mean, that's where we started with the Hobbes and the question of property ownership. I think that a lot of readers will be surprised to see this rubric brought into the book and centered to such an extent. So could you maybe speak a little bit about how indigeneity comes into your arguments?
I've been thinking with indigeneity on several axes, some of which make their explicit appearance in the book, and others sort of operate in a more subterranean way. So for one, it was very important to the work that the book does with W.B. Du Bois that indigeneity sort of emerge as a method and a resource. In the W.B. Du Bois chapter, one of the arguments at its heart is that Du Bois could accomplish many things, and he was marvelously prolific, and in the course of a lifetime of writing, very much capable of revisiting, recasting his perspectives on everything from the place of ancient Greece and Rome in the historical trajectories of bearing and relevance to African-American communities, to the significance of Marxist-style approaches to the Reconstruction as a moment in American history and its failures. But one thing that I argue in that chapter he does not quite seem capable of doing is recognizing indigenous presence in the United States and also globally. And the reason that's consequential for me is because I am using Du Bois as a way of thinking about some of the gaps that attach to my own lines of sight, my own capacity as a historically situated interpreter of this tradition that I am trying to analyze under the rubric of classicism. And as I study the process of classicism, I have to take stock of the degree to which, for those of us who have been claimed or have sought to claim a space in that tradition, there may be certain epistemic resources that come online for us and that enable us to make sense of the full ambit of communities with which we're entering into relation. And there are also maybe resources that actively inhibit, if not constrict, the capacity we have to identify those communities. So the work with Du Bois in one of the chapters of the book is partly intended to show how that inhibition applies in Du Bois's own training and formation as someone uniquely attuned to the significance of ancient Greek and Roman texts, as someone who, as Matthias Hans's will show in a forthcoming monograph, really attached himself and sought to repeatedly reinvent himself by reference to Cicero. At the same time, though, to go back to earlier material in the book, I have been very inspired by the work of colleagues such as Catherine Blouin and others who have sought to show what indigenizing classics might look like. Even as I remain committed to a critique that Sasha-Mae, Eccleston, and I had floated in a co-authored article, and that has appeared in other corners too, of how the move to identifying and then bringing into conversation historically minoritized and or dispossessed communities for the purposes of a kind of rejuvenation of classics and classical studies is necessarily an exploitative move, right? So what I'm trying
it's totally vampiric, right?
Yeah, it's like totally vampiric. And so what I'm trying to do is say, I want to think with colleagues in indigenous studies, and I want to be in community with them, cognizant of my own limitations in this regard, the limitations of training and formation. And I do not want to enter into these disciplinary spaces actuated by the belief, or even so much as an intuition, that by entering these spaces, I'm somehow doing something for the discipline of classics or seeking to accomplish something on behalf of the discipline of classics. That is not my interest at all. What I am interested to pursue instead is a way of imagining our relations to worlds constituted as ancient or distant from us, according to the precepts of classicism that I enumerated in the introduction, that can also participate in conversations led by folks working in indigenous studies. The coda to that, and one that's important for understanding a moment in the introduction that then gets revisited in the footnotes later in the book, is that for all that there has been discussion of decolonization in classics and classical studies, I am loath to adopt that term uncritically if there is no corresponding commitment to the resource distribution, and specifically the redistribution of land and assets generated on land that would, in my view, be necessary in order to see through a properly decolonizing project. So there I do take exception to some of the work that has, over the past 15 to 20 years, adopted some degree of decolonizing language and even ethos in classics, but without fully attending to the demands on redistribution that, in my view, are, I think, ethically imperative if that work is to be carried out effectively and well.
So could you just give a concrete example? I mean, I think if I understand correctly, we're in the world of decolonization is not a metaphor, right? Could you give a little bit of a concrete example for listeners of what you mean about this kind of redistribution? What might an example of that look like?
So the best example is the one that leads off the book. The preface starts by talking about Gaza, and I am interested in talking about Gaza for the simple reason that here, it seemed to me, we had, over the past few years, students at a host of institutions organizing effectively to draw attention to the degree to which the financialization of the modern university, a process that is based on land, among other things, has directly implicated these universities in a genocidal catastrophe. And these students, for their efforts, and faculty colleagues for their efforts, have been subjected to one of the single most pernicious forms of targeting that we have been privy to in our lifetimes. That, to me, is a clear-cut example, because what we're dealing with when we talk about the fate of Gaza is nothing short of a real-time exemplification of how dispossession conspires with other forms of settler colonial enterprise in order to render an entire people completely open and subject to the worst kinds of violence one can imagine. For me, the work that remains to be done in classics about this is twofold. First, I have seen it as uniquely revealing of the discipline's most demoralizing habits of thought and work to notice how on the classics listserv, any mention or posting by people who are putting up notices of events that touch on Gaza in whole or in part is met immediately with some of the most vitriolic rhetoric that appears on the listserv, period. But there's another side to this that colleagues like Chella Ward and Madhura Umachandran and others have taken great care to emphasize. And now I'm going to sort of think briefly with the Critical Ancient World Studies project, and also Chella's more recent publications on Islamophobia and the sort of constitution of classicism around Islamophobia. It, I think, is part of any robust commitment to the intellectual histories of the discipline, to think about how the discipline in its various institutional forms in the Anglo-Americas and beyond has organized itself around a series of ideological commitments that are reflexes of financial and capitalized investments, right? Mm-hmm. And there, it would seem to me that by not even granting a space or being willing to sort of actively entertain some of the work that Chella and Madhura and colleagues in that work have pursued, classicists of a certain intellectual formation are denying themselves an opportunity to think expansively about the history of their discipline. So, like, to me, over and above the question of what kinds of resource distribution are appropriate to the current moment, a question that I see as urgent, if one wants to think in the most sort of local and really most sort of constraining terms possible about what the discipline can do, and if one is wedded to the kinds of clinical inquiry that we had been discussing earlier, then at the very least, what one can do is think about how to become a better intellectual historian. And the people who are arraying themselves against this kind of work and who are sort of seeking to push back on it on the grounds that, classics can't be a political discipline, or classics should steer clear of these various commitments, or worse, who are saying things like, Palestinians are not indigenous inhabitants of the places that they claim. These folks are engaging in several forms of collusion with power, sure, but they're also showing themselves to be bad historians. And so that to me is the real problem. That is, I think, where we see a commitment to a rather sclerotic version of disciplinary practice, animating a host of political enterprises that seem to me ultimately to provide fodder for doubling down on the sort of imaginatively circumscribed and, for that matter, ethically vacuous positions that seem to be very much in favor of some colleagues on the classics listserv. So I'll say that and allow myself that opportunity for sort of the briefest expression of antagonism there. But to turn back to what your question was asking specifically about how we might think of concrete examples that illustrate the points that I had raised earlier, I would simply ask colleagues to think critically about where their institutions are based and how the material footprints of their own institutions, whether they're teaching in university settings or K-12 settings or hold para-academic jobs of various kinds, are in any way locked into circuits of capital exploitation. That's the critique I want to set out. One does not need to range all that far in order to find the material footprint of this close to oneself.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, I think you're really also eloquent about this, again, in the introduction, where you write that if it's okay if I quote it, that if classicists are not to disavow the field's name, and there are good reasons for doing just that, then we who are hailed by the discipline need to think harder about the demands and merits of striving for value in a way that simultaneously honors our ethical obligations to this confounded and confounding world, and to the past and past peoples who brought this world into being. This effort, you'll argue below, should be reparative, and that the field of classics should not only directly confront, but actively seek to reverse ill-gotten gains under a global system of racial capitalism. And I thought it was very interesting that that passage occurs, I think, in the context or shortly after of your discussion or your response to this common criticism that classicists need to stay in their lane. I wonder, maybe you could say I mean, or have you said it?
I guess to be clear, I'm not interested in staying in my lane. No, but I mean, I think the one thing that I was prepared at an early point to concede to some critics was that, and this is something that I raised in the preface, and that I have also tried to linger with in some other publications, is the possibility that I might be engaging in a kind of epistemic trespassing, or that to really channel the emerita classicists and other similarly orientated folks who have directed criticism at me and others over the years, maybe we just don't know enough. I paused on that for a moment, partly because time and again in my own life, I've seen that criticism appear in many different settings and receive its articulation from folks well outside the contemporary flashpoints of interest to the opening pages of the book. And I've thought long and hard about what it might mean not to know enough, and also what it means to know enough to act. For me, it seems that one damaging consequence of our intellectual formation and the styles it assumes is that we are led to believe that we have to accumulate enough knowledge to be deemed authoritative on X, Y, or Z before we can then proceed to be authoritative about X, Y, and Z. And I am prepared to insist, as other colleagues have insisted, that there are cases when one does not need to be sitting on decades worth of accumulated training and formation in order to make an ethically sensible intervention in the world. But I'm also prepared to say that the very temporality implicit in what I've just said, and also in the kinds of criticism that I've paraphrased, is misguided. After all, we are always in the habit of repeatedly readjusting and fine-tuning our insights based on knowledge that we glean. Like, we're all closet Bayesians, or not so closet Bayesians in my case. And it is okay to have had one opinion and then to learn and then decide that actually, based on what I know now, I'm prepared to revisit my earlier opinion. This is responsible research and teaching. It's also responsible collegiality too. So I would say that, while on the one hand it can be exhilarating for me at least to be a bit of a contrarian and say I'm never going to stay in any lane. There's a much humbler commitment, I think, that serves to ground this work, and that is the idea that, first of all, I am called to act on what I know, and what I know is that we are living in a world that is defined by pretty violent excesses of inequality and exploitation. And also that I am called to continue my own education on this and many other matters. And that the lessons that, I seek to distill from these various case studies in the book, notably the one focused on Du Bois, are not to be lost on me, and nor should they be lost on others. The things that we learn can certainly point us in better, because more intellectually and ethically efficacious directions. But the things that we learn can also, at times, depending on the forms of learning that we undertake and the types of learning that we do, the kinds of communities of learning into which we slot ourselves, they can sometimes blunt our capacity to act ethically. And so being cognizant of that is one obligation of any responsible humanist, but I also think it's a obligation that attaches specifically to those of us who are seeking to create and nourish a space for ancient studies at a time of governmental, institutionalized resistance to the very facts of studying the past.
There are so many other things that we could cover in this conversation. Things that I'm particularly interested in is your critique of the privileging of textualization in the textual form, or I'd be curious to hear what you mentioned Walter Scheidel's book on ancient history. I'd be very curious to hear your take on that. But I think, people are just going to have to read your book. I think the last thing that I'll ask you is to pick up this thread of those of us who are trying to cultivate and nourish space for ancient studies in this present moment. What do you think the prospects are in terms of the disciplines, plural, for this material? Is there any hope in the trajectory right now, or?
Yeah, hope is the thing with feathers and all that. I've gone back and forth a little on this. So I spent a decent stretch of August in the company of Hannah Proctor's book Burnout, which I very much recommend to folks. It's very close to me on one of my shelves, and I reach for it often. This was a book that, among other things, addresses itself to how to feel at a time when, for those of us who are committed to various progressive left causes, much of the world seems to be in flames. And many of our most dogged efforts to bring about a new world have been stymied or completely neutralized. And for me, it was instructive not just to, revisit these sort of semi-tired lines with a Gramscian pedigree, things like pessimism of the intellect, hope of the will, and all that, but also to reflect on what it is that I would need to grieve, to acknowledge as lost and then to grieve, in order to move in the direction of a more creative praxis down the road. In the context of ancient studies, as in many other contexts, and in the context of institutionalized ancient studies at that, I am prepared to state without hesitation that in some important ways, the battle to secure and maintain institutional support for the professional study of the ancient world has been lost. Just look at the job cycle. There are so few jobs. Like, what are we doing admitting PhD students? I often wonder. I say this as someone who just cycled off being the director of graduate studies.
Well, Brown's not.
Right? I mean, so like, yeah. Like some departments are not, right? Like, and I mean, it could be that ours is next. Like, I say this because I want to frame what comes next. So for me, it is helpful to be alert to where something has not gone right in order to begin developing a path forward, right? And sometimes I feel that there is a kind of like resistance to grief, or like a sort of resistance to grievability. Like I think we would all benefit from acknowledging that there have been pretty serious losses as a consequence of the market and political developments of the past 2 decades. And that these have come with all kinds of negative externalities, ranging from the erosion of our students' abilities to read to like the amplification of the precariat and of the precarious professoriate. All of this has taken place, and it must be grieved. Like it actually has to be centered as an object for grieving. And from there, we then move on to the work that needs doing, right? So like once we get into spaces together and can have a frank series of conversations about what is lost. Like, and when I say there are things that are lost, I truly mean to say that there are some things that are not coming back. I think we need to then pivot to the question of what we can realize together in a new political and institutional order that, you know, may have some roots in the past that constituted us as disciplinary actors, but it's going to be very different. In practical terms, I think a lot about what it might mean to develop more durable coalitions with other communities of learners devoted to the study of the ancient world, but in the most holistic way imaginable. Like I am thinking about what it might mean to, for instance, build up and stand alongside Mesoamericanists, or Africanists with whom I spend a fair amount of time, or South Asian studies folks who focus on Vedic and post-Vedic communities and institutions, all that. But that work of coalition building, which I think is vital if there is to be any future for ancient studies, has to take place on the other side of a sort of disciplinary acknowledgement that in its current form, what we are doing is surviving at a few institutions, but has met its end in most other institutional settings. And that's okay. It's not great. But once we acknowledge that and give the people who want to grieve that development an opportunity to grieve it, then we have to move on to thinking about what comes next. I know that I have not fully answered your question because I don't know what comes next, honestly.
Yeah, well, it's no one person's job, I don't think.
Yeah, it's not one person's job, but also and this is a text that I keep coming back to because Hannah Proctor does excellent work with it. Che Guevara in the Congo Diary has this little sentence where he says that he couldn't overcome subjectivity in the end. I mean, he's talking about how he fails as a leader. And the reason he says he can't overcome subjectivity is, well, I mean, there's several reasons. One of them is that he's too interested in solitary reading to like actually connect with people in conversation. So he's supposed to be like training people and forming them, but he just wants to read, right? And I have to be more exacting about this in talking about the kinds of work that surface in classicism and other phobias and in other contexts. Really and truly what I've wanted to do for much of my adult life, and I'm sure you and many other classicists feel the same way, is read. Like I have wanted very few other things in my life. And now I'm recognizing that like my own doubling down on the commitment to reading, which is, I think yielded some consequential outcomes over the years, is coming into collision with something else. Like I am called to read, and I'm called to read in community and all that, but like I'm also called to enter in and work with communities in ways that they deprive me of the time to read, of the leisure to read. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the capacity to imagine a future that can elicit from me more than just sort of a cursory nod of recognition, a future that is true to what Ignacio Sanchez Prado has termed the right to an intellectual life, is running up against some of my own limitations when it comes to what I'm willing to surrender. Maybe I'm not going to have all this time to read luxuriously, and that's okay. And maybe what I'm being called to do, as many others are being called to do, is engage in a form of outward-facing humanistic activity that acknowledges reading as one of a series of practices for making meaning in the world, but one that should not be privileged to the degrees that it has now. I say this fearfully because reading is so undercut and undervalued now that to say, well, it should be one of several aesthetic and meaning-making activities, not like a sort of privileged one within our field, is going to, elicit Jupiter's thunderbolt from any moment now. But I'm thinking out loud with you because I recognize that from like a strictly materialist perspective, the time that I spend reading is time that I could and should be spending doing other things. And that the time that I spend doing those other things is going to be so key to building up the kinds of coalitionary forces that might one day make of this world something better, that there are moments when I really do struggle to justify what I think classicism and other phobias represents, namely a commitment to a very expansive mode of reading. So I'm just going to put that out there in the streets and hope that your listeners take that up.
I've often thought about this in terms of like this conflict between the Mary and Martha paradigms, right? Is it the study or versus the activity? And I think, that this brings us back in a way to the thing that I only gestured at by way of Pride Radio is your critique of the privileging of intextualization. I mean, it strikes me that one of the reasons it's so hard to contemplate moving beyond that is precisely because of the capitalist frameworks that have been at, kind of running under the surface of this whole conversation, I think, is that, reading and writing, it's work you can measure in consumption of words and pages and output of words and pages, right? But this other kind of work is not quantifiable in that same way. And so I think we've been so ingrained, with the publisher parish or what, all these kinds of things that it is an intellectual and also kind of spiritual lift to reorient to a different form of knowledge production and sustenance. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, you are someone who always is reading and writing a lot. And could you maybe share what you're working on now? What's next for you?
I am reading Moon Sharania's Archive of Tongues, an intimate history of brownness, in preparation for a series of papers on affect and affect theory that I'm supposed to be giving in November. We'll see how these papers get written. I've also been rereading a book that I came across some years ago, Elizabeth Young Poole's Why Arendt Matters. Partly an effort to sort of diagnose why I was so sort of hesitant or reluctant about the vogue that Arendt enjoyed among classicists in the 2010s. I'm still sort of curious about this. And yeah, then I'm starting to read this novel that I came across in one of our used book drop-offs in East Pine. Sara Cordon's Para Español Pulse Dos. And that's what's keeping me going these days when I'm not watching reality TV, which is the other major and far less justifiable the time expenditure.
Well, this is going to be my next question for you. Is now the new podcast question is, what are you reading or watching or listening to or doing that's been bringing you some joy lately?
The Yankees are in the playoffs. I went to game 162 yesterday. I took one of my kids. It was great. We are watching baseball. It is a rollicking good time until your team gets eliminated, and I'm sure the Yanks will be eliminated imminently. So there's that. We consume a lot of reality TV in my household. Much of it borders on the dystopian. We just completed the most recent season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and we I've also just started the new season of Special Forces, which aired last week. And we now have to wait for some of the other installments in the reality TV universe that we've grown fond of over the years. There's a lot of attachment to Love Island in my house, but we're gonna hold off until the next U.S. season of Love Island. And Traders USA will come back at some point in the next few months, at which point I will be thrilled to sit down with it. So yeah, it's all giving joy. Those give joy. Until the Yanks get eliminated, then I'll be miserable.
I feel like you're just saying that apotropically.
I mean, they will be.
Well, Danielle, congratulations on the book. I think we could have had the conversation go on and on and on, but I don't want to, aspire to some other podcast franchises that, sit for 2-3 hours. But I hope this will, the sort of incomplete nature of this conversation will just encourage more people to read and share this book. So congratulations, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.